Hi everyone, welcome to Be Well Live. Today is Try It Thursday. This is Mike, Sport Coordinator with Athletics and Recreation at Seneca College. Today we're going to be talking about avoiding wrist pain when performing push-ups. So that seems to be a really common symptom or limiting factor when doing push-ups. Obviously the muscular endurance and strength that's involved, you notice whether or not you can perform a push-up, but it's the wrist that we tend to experience pain from, or just general discomfort that limits how many push-ups we can do. So here's a couple tips on just how to avoid that wrist pain that you'll experience when you're performing the push-up, and then a couple of preventative measures you can take as well. So yeah, let's start with the preventative. Obviously, it's obvious, but just make sure that you have proper form when doing a push-up. If you are placing too much weight over your body, if your hands are too wide or too narrow, if your elbows are sticking out too much, little things like this can distribute your weight and the force, the load when you're performing a push-up. So if you're placing too much weight forward, what happens is your wrists will go into too much of a extension, like a hyperextension. So then what you're doing is you're placing way too much weight on that extended wrist. So that's typically how you'll experience that wrist pain when you're doing that push-up. So any kind of, even just from the knees, if you're putting too much weight on that extended wrist, you could be putting more strain on the wrist that is unnecessary. So little things like that you can prevent from getting that wrist pain. But let's say that you have perfect push-up form and you're still experiencing that pain. So why is that? So the next thing is typically is from overuse, from occupation, ergonomics. So if you're sitting at your desk and you don't have the proper level for where your desk is and you're using your mouse, typically if even the small difference between here and then that, where if the desk is too low, you're gonna have that kind of extension. So when you're typing on your computer and you're using your mouse, make sure that you have the appropriate ergonomically correct position so that you're preventing the overuse and strain that you're placing on your hand, wrist, and forearm. Okay? So if you have that, no matter how perfect your push-up form is, you're still going to experience that discomfort, so you want to take care of that. And then lastly, doing stretches and mobility work and strengthening exercises for the actual wrist and forearm. We're not going to get into that, but just make sure that when you're doing your warm-ups, a lot of people neglect the wrist and the forearms, so they typically do bigger muscle groups when they're performing those movements that they're warming up. But really focus on doing those wrist extensors and flexor stretches where you can kind of get those smaller kind of muscles stretched. Okay, so next are modifications. So let's say you're doing all the precautions, the preventative measures for the imbalances of the hand, wrist, elbow area. There are some modifications you can do if you're still experiencing that chronic pain in the wrist. So the first one here is using a yoga mat or even a towel. You can roll it up. And what that does is basically when you place the heel, I guess, of your hand on the edge of that rolled up towel or yoga mat, when you're performing the push-ups, what you can do is you can position it so that now your wrist is not in as extended of a position. So when you're performing those push-ups versus on the floor, and now you've got that extra extension where you're getting more strain on the wrist. Okay, so just a little tip, you could use that rolled up yoga mat, which really helps change the angle at which your wrist is in extension. The next one, if you do have a pair of dumbbells, what you can do is a neutral position for your wrist. So what we mean by a neutral position, so basically it's just straight. So there's no flexion or extension, it's just that locked neutral position. So you do actually have another choice. You could do knuckle push-ups, which not many people like to do just because it's obviously uncomfortable for obvious reasons when you're doing it just flat on the floor like that. What you can do is if you have a dumbbell big enough so there's hand clearance underneath it, you can perform the push-ups in that neutral wrist position, and it should help alleviate any of the pain that you get doing regular push-ups. Okay? Give those all a try, and hopefully that helps with your wrist pain for when you're doing push-ups. Thanks for joining. Be well, everyone. See ya. Cheers.